So thanks so much for agreeing to talk to our students today. I know you're a busy man. We really appreciate the time.
Pleasure.
We focus quite a lot on digital journalism, social video, and those sorts of things. And our broadcast pathway have their social video assessment next week. So this couldn't be better time for them. Broadcast journalism, we're all watching together, which means that one of these windows has 20 people in it.
All right. Hi to those of you watching together.
So just for a little bit of background, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Ros is 47 now and lives in South London with a wife and two kids, grew up in Cornwall and a few places abroad. I've read the Caribbean and South Africa.
Yeah, my dad was originally a fisherman in Newlyn in Cornwall, but then he became a fisheries consultant for the UN and used to travel to Africa primarily, not only, but to Africa primarily, and run fisheries training courses essentially. And most of the time he'd go away for between 3 and 8 weeks. So he'd be quite often away when we were out, but we'd stay in Cornwall. But a couple of times he got offered longer gigs. One of them was in Trinidad and one of them was in the Bahamas. And mum and dad decided that would be an exciting thing for us to do. So I was at primary school in Helston in Cornwall, but took a couple of breaks from that to live in the Bahamas for a couple of years and Trinidad for about a year in total. So that's why I lived there. And then South Africa, I had a girlfriend who was South African at university. And after we graduated, to give you an abbreviated version of the story, she moved to Johannesburg and a few months later I followed.
So not bad grounding for a future World Service presenter.
Right. Yeah, I think there was always in our house a lot of things about the world around me. My mum and my dad would be, whether it was literature or music or art or history. And so I always was very interested in not just our country, but lots of other countries. And then, of course, having the chance to live abroad 3 times only feeds that, really.
So for the students watching, hi everyone, by the way, welcome. We're going to do a sort of a Q&A to start off with, and then hopefully about halfway through we'll leave some space for you to ask as many questions as you can. If you want to at that point turn your camera on and ask the question, feel free. You can raise your hand in the box if you want to. You can ask your question in the chat if you want to, but we'll try and leave as much space as possible for you guys to ask questions. But I've got a lot of things that I want to ask first. Ros, you joined the BBC in was it 2001, just after September 11th?
That's right. Yeah, just a few weeks after.
Is that must have been a fascinating time, without being crude, to join the BBC, because that was the point at which digital really as a medium grew. People saw the traffic from September the 11th, and I think the development of the technology was a bit of a realization for a lot of corporations. What sort of place did you find when you joined?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I'm not sure that's my memory, because if you think about where we are in 2022 with big media organizations and big news organizations still trying to navigate how broadcast and digital interact, well, if you go back 21 years to 2001 when I joined and became a producer on 5 Live, our focus almost entirely was making radio. Our focus wasn't really on creating digital content out of radio. Our focus was really on the live radio product. And so while you're right, in the very early days of the BBC's digital offering, events like 9/11 would have driven a lot of a spike in traffic. I wasn't sitting anywhere near the people who were making our digital journalism. I was sitting in a newsroom making a radio station, and we were just, not just to be dismissive, but we were only really focused on radio. So I remember all my discussions when I arrived as a radio producer being, how do we make these programs better? How do we make our radio network better? But one of the things that I started to wrestle with almost from day one, because I'd come in from editing, I used to edit Time Out's website before they made me redundant, and that led to me applying to the BBC. And I had edited a few websites for the 2 or 3 years before I joined the BBC. And one of the things I was preoccupied with in those early days was, how could you get online discussions and online activity to influence a live radio broadcast? I was very interested in how you could potentially intertwine those. And I can remember soon after I arrived in 2001 saying, I really want to see how we could intertwine a digital audience and a broadcast audience. I didn't have the answer, by the way, and I still don't. But the idea that those two things could connect better was there when I arrived. And I was also aware that collectively at the BBC, we didn't quite know how to do that. text messages into a radio program was pretty much the limit of it at that point. And what's interesting for me as I get older and grayer, and I look back at those very early conversations in 2001 about how you could do that, really my career has been a series of efforts to try and do that. I used to present a TV and radio program called World Have Your Say, which was an interactive discussion program. Outside Source is a response to the way that content is produced and consumed digitally, but how can you manifest that in a TV form? My explainer videos are also produced by a TV production team, often on live TV, but they are designed to perform digitally. And so in lots of different ways, that core idea that I was wrestling with when I arrived as a 27-year-old is really still the idea that I'm wrestling with now, that you have digital audiences and broadcast audiences, digital production systems and broadcast production systems, and they don't automatically fit together. But if you can find ways of fitting them together, it can be very powerful.
Well, you said just now you don't have the answers, but you're coming as close as I think I've seen anybody else to fusing news and social media in a genuine way. And one of the ways you do that is by interaction. It must take a lot of work. When I fanboy your videos and say, oh, this is great work from Ros, you will respond to me. But you do that to a lot of people, don't you? I'm not special. It takes a lot of work for you to talk to those people all the time.
Well, I think one of the things that well, generally, and I would say this this doesn't just apply when you're trying to develop a digital product, replying to people generally is a good idea. Like if someone sends me an email, they're going to get a reply from me. And I feel like generally replying to people and engaging with people in newsroom environments, and frankly, in any corporate environment or working environment, largely is going to be it's polite and it's a reasonable thing to do, but it also serves you because you develop relationships. And the more people think of you as being reliable or likable or trustworthy or these kind of things, the more they're going to be willing to work with you and help you and do things with you. So for me, replying is a big thing. So I'm glad you noticed. I reply to everyone. The second thing is that if you imagine broadcasting in its traditional form, it's a very simple act in some ways. You make a program. That bit's not simple, but you make a program, you put it on the TV, the audience is there if it's there, consumes it, it likes it, it doesn't like it, somewhere in between, and you move on. But the means by which you deliver that piece of work is simple. You're on the TV, it goes on to people's TVs and they watch. How you deliver a digital piece of content is much, much, much more complicated, and it's much more connected to a network of people. To state the obvious, the internet is a network. And for me, the success of our explainers as a digital product is profoundly connected to our ability to develop a network around it, so that when I push out an explainer video, there are people who have shared some of them before, or maybe didn't like one and we had an interaction with it about it and they thought, okay, well, I'll maybe watch this guy again. And the number of views that we're able to generate on social platforms is directly related to networks of people around the product. And an essential part of building a network is for the person who's the face of it to be present in those networks, to take part in them, to help build them. It's not reasonable for me to be absent while my colleagues are trying to build that network. People, when they consume digitally, connect very powerfully with the people who are featured in those products. And so in this case, it's me, and it's appropriate for me to be present as that product is shared digitally. And it has a double benefit in that hopefully it makes the product seem more approachable and more part of that world, but it also helps to build a network without which you can't hope to succeed. So I very much appreciate you sharing my videos, and that is an important part of the equation for me, because if you and lots of other people don't, it just doesn't work. I can make a TV program and just simply put it on the TV, and that distribution will happen anyway. If I put a video online and I've got no network built around it, the chances of it performing are much, much lower than if it does have a network around it.
The way that networks work best, I think, in the newsroom is that exactly what you're doing. Again, I love the strategy that you use. You push it out, you convert the people who become fans, and they push it out on your behalf. There's your initial network, and then there's those persons' networks, and then there's third and fourth waves like ripples, and that's one of the ways you help generate what 6.5 million views.
So we've had some very high numbers in the last few months, which has been exciting. And you're right, to get those kind of numbers, you can't do that on your own, even if you're the BBC. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that if you look across, it's quite an interesting thing for those of you watching to do. If you go to the biggest news Twitter accounts in the world, so the real big, I don't know what the biggest is, like CNN is even, the BBC's ones are huge. CNN's main one is even bigger. There are other big American media brands with very, very large followings. And if you go to the front, if you go to the page and you click on media, you can see all the videos that these massive news organizations have pushed out, and have a look at the number of views. I can't guarantee this, but normally there might be an exception with 1 on a million. The majority of them will be below 250,000 per video. Then go and look up some of the most successful journalists, individuals who are posting videos about the news, and I guarantee you'll find views that are higher. And for me, this is a really powerful point about digital, is that of course I can't make these videos without the BBC. It entirely rests on the brilliance of many, many colleagues and the fantastic infrastructure around what we're doing. But for digital to really connect, in my experience, you also need an individual or a series of individuals who are also part of that distribution. And it's quite interesting to observe that sometimes we will post videos and they will do incredibly well, better than videos being posted by some of the biggest news organizations in the world. And it's because of that ripple effect that you're describing, that I post it, some people who have a relationship with the explainer product post it, and then it goes and goes and goes and goes. Doesn't always happen, but it can happen.
And people connect with the individual these days more than the organization or the publication. I mean, if you just look at on yours, Outside Sources Twitter page as 67,000, whereas I think you have 345,000. People connect with individuals.
So I think that's true. I don't know if that illustration is quite true, because I think that Twitter account's been dormant for a while. You better check, but I don't think we've been using that for some time. But one of the reasons we stopped using it, and this is part of a broader BBC strategy, was that the BBC News sought to reduce the number of BBC branded Twitter accounts that we had, because it was clear that we were at risk of spreading ourselves too thin and not giving our main accounts more impact. And I don't have the data to hand, but about 10 years ago, there was a big push around this, and they focused on, off the top of my head, I think it's BBC News, BBC Breaking, and BBC World. And as they focused on those 3 big accounts, the number of followers on those accounts went through the roof, and they're now very, very high. But you're, I think, correct to observe, it's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about it because I guess it involves me, but you are correct to observe that the role of individuals as distributors of big newsrooms content is becoming more pronounced. And I did an interview with Ben Smith, who until recently was the media columnist of the New York Times. Before that, he edited BuzzFeed News. And he's forming a new news organization. And I interviewed him on the media show of Radio 4 the other day. And he talked about, I may get the exact phrase he used wrong, but he essentially talked about news's shift towards a talent-based structure. So his point was that by talent, he means individuals. So he was saying that the big individuals are now central to how news organizations need to push out their content. That's not to say there aren't other ways of pushing it out via centrally branded means. BBC iPlayer, BBC News website, of course, they're hugely important. But one part of the equation is definitely, how do you use individuals to distribute your work as well? And you mentioned my number of followers. I mean, that's dwarfed by people like Robert Peston, Laura Kunzberg, Nick Robinson. These are major content channels. They wouldn't put it in those terms, but that is essentially what they are. They're hugely influential content channels, which are part of in the case of Laura and Nick, part of the BBC's portfolio of means of distribution. Whereas if you went back 20 years when I joined the BBC, the means of distribution all belonged to the BBC. They were radio networks, TV networks, a new website. but the role of the individual is becoming more important. There's no doubt.
Are you comfortable with that? Because I think the explainer videos have taken you to a new level of prominence. Has that had much of an effect on you as a person?
Yeah, it's been takes a little. It takes a little getting used to. I mean, I've been a radio and TV presenter for quite a long time, so I'm used to some level of public recognition. But certainly, these explainers have moved that up a notch or two. I mean, I mainly feel of it as I think if you ask most people who are in the public domain on behalf of the BBC, they would just say that it feels like a privilege and that it's quite humbling and that you take it very, very seriously. And I guess the higher profile you become more acutely aware of that as well. Because when I do a video on Ukrainian history and how it fits into the situation in Ukraine today, that work is being associated with me because it's my face on it and it's my voice, and it's sometimes, it's more often, these are my words, and so on. But of course, it's the product of exceptional work by the producers, by the director, by the auto cue person, by the sound person, by the variety of colleagues we've consulted on those scripts. The list goes. The graphics people. It's the work of many, many people. So I don't know if I feel uncomfortable being the face of it because I'm a presenter, and so I guess I've made my choice on that. But I certainly feel like it's an enormous responsibility, and one that I take incredibly seriously.
Let's take a slight step back a bit. You started Outside Source in 2014.
Yeah.
And the first explainer video arrived in what I've seen said to be the first explainer video was the Australian bushfires in 2019.
Yeah, that's right.
Which I was watching yesterday and comparing to your current stuff and the differences.
Oh yeah, how have they evolved?
I was going to make you watch them and analyze them for ourselves, but I won't do that. The Australian bushfires one was slower. It was longer. You had a guest in the studio, I think.
Yeah, but I think what you're seeing there is, so there's a funny-ish story here, which is that, or an unusual story, which is that I had spent about 6 months in 2019 thinking and writing and reading a lot about how to have a greater digital impact with a TV program. And I'd done lots of work around tone and impartiality and thinking about graphics, length of clips, you name it. I'd done a lot of work, written a few documents. I was feeling good to go, and the bushfires came along, and we hadn't decided to start what I was proposing that we do. And Outside Source generally, I hope, is a kind of high protein collation of the most useful information on a story. And we do that every night. And someone in Australia had seen us do an extended report on the Australia bushfires, had filmed it on their phone off the TV, and had put it on YouTube. And then it was doing like 150, 200,000 views on YouTube, and people were sharing it going, this is great. And the woman who produced it, is a brilliant reporter and producer called Courtney Bembridge, spotted it and said, have you seen the thing we did yesterday or the day before as doing good numbers? And we're like, okay, that, all right. And that kind of bounced us into going from the theoretical work I'd been doing around this to think, okay, well, maybe we should actually start doing it. So the first one that went viral was long because it wasn't intended. The second one and the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth one, if you look them up, are all 2.5 minutes. So we kind of spotted the chance and then much more consciously started to implement some of the theory that I'd been working up over the last few months.
So it's all an accident. You were just lucky. Length is really important because people will tell you that on a social media video, the first 1.5 to 3 seconds are the key hook to grab people, and it has to be short. It should be 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Your content really sort of proves that to be a lie. If the content is good enough, then people will engage.
Right. And this has been a bugbear of mine for years, that somehow we'd all decided that videos had to be really short. And it seemed to me that there was a huge appetite for more detail. Outside Source, when I created it as a format, was in part a response to other TV formats that I'd been watching and thinking quite often when I watch these formats, I'm not getting as much detail per minute as I want. So Outside Source was was designed to be a kind of high protein delivery system of detail. And so I'd always been keen on doing things at length and doing things in detail. The trick for me was never do it 2 minutes, do it 10 minutes. The trick was always, how well is the story told and how much are you getting per minute and how good is it? Those were the bigger drivers, because I was seeing, for example, in the world of comedy with The Daily Show or John Oliver, 15-minute sequences on a subject performing incredibly well on YouTube. There were lots of other examples too of people doing things at Vox, one of the original news organizations to really commit to explanation. They'd do a 10-minute video on a subject that wasn't even in the news that day, and it would rack up huge numbers of views. The New York Times has got a good track record on this as well. So it seemed to me that if you could make it very watchable, very helpful, that if you went long, that wouldn't be a problem. So for me, it's not about should it be 2 minutes or 5 minutes. It's how much is it? How much is it worth? How much good stuff? How much helpful stuff do we have to put in this video to make it worth someone watching for 6 minutes? And if the answer is we've got enough to justify 6 minutes, then 6 minutes it is.
You've talked about ruthless efficiency editorially, not using adjectives, paring language back as much as you can, to get that sort of almost a fact per minute ratio. And it reminds me, and go with me on this digression, of Airplane, the film, where the producers had a gagged per minute ratio, but that was doing exactly the same thing. And I noticed that you said that you studied some comedians when you looked at how to deliver these videos. So I wondered, when you looked at comedy, was it John Oliver that you were looking at specifically? What did you take from that world?
So the primary lesson that I took, so those of us of a certain age will always remember when The Daily Show, well, it was already popular in the US, and suddenly it became so popular that even those of us in the UK were aware, okay, there's this phenomenon going on in the US. And lots of people in the UK media looked at that and thought, okay, well, how can we create a kind of Daily Show, a version of The Daily Show over here? What are the lessons that we should learn? And the lesson I saw a lot of people taking from that was that you need jokes to get certain types of people watching. An audience who may not want to watch classic news were watching Jon Stewart on very serious subjects at great length, but he was mixing it with jokes as well. I didn't take that conclusion. My conclusion was, this is evidence people will watch on serious subjects at length if you tell the stories differently. So my conclusion wasn't I need to put jokes in my program. I didn't think that then, and I don't think that now. My conclusion was, if you tell the story so effectively that the person watching just wants to know what's coming next, what's coming next, what's coming next, then you could talk for a very long time on a very serious and detailed and important story, and people would stay with you. So that was the main conclusion that I took from that. But you're right. I am obsessed, as my colleagues will tell you, with sparse scripting. Sparse short sentences are, for me, absolutely fundamental to getting across complicated ideas. Because if you are trying to communicate things that are complex and nuanced and difficult, then you want to give yourself the best chance of doing that. And sparse sentences, short sentences, are the best way of doing that.
If there are people there who would like to ask questions, maybe the best thing to do is to put them in the chat, and then I'll call you in turn if you want to switch your cameras on and do it while we do it. And while you're all thinking of your question and trying to get your hands in first, I want to ask, I've got 4 pages of questions, which we're not going to do. I was wondering about the level of editorial sign-off on what you do, because people will perceive it to be you, right? But there's a huge amount of sign-off that goes into your product. A lot of different people see it, a lot of experts within the BBC, a lot of higher ups within the BBC. So could you explain to us what that process is like, and maybe using the example of the next video that you're going to do?
Yeah, well, the sign-off process is considerable. One of the things that I've tried to do with these videos and with Outside Source is to talk about the news with a different tone and with a different and sometimes more blunt form of language. I think as misinformation has become more and more of a pronounced issue for all of us, not just journalists, but all of us as we go about our lives, there was clearly an appetite for the news media, not just the BBC, for all of us to be more explicit when people were saying things that weren't true, or be more explicit when people were suggesting something was happening when in fact something different was happening. And for me to be more blunt and more direct, so if I run a clip of a politician saying something and I come off the back of it and I say, that's not true, in fact, it's X, needless to say, the stakes are higher because you're being more blunt and you're being more direct. And the BBC's the most powerful thing we have at the BBC is the trust that our audience place in us. And if you mess with that trust, then you're messing with everything the BBC has. So you don't mess with it. You take it incredibly seriously. And so I was acutely aware that as I started to experiment with what's become labeled assertive impartiality, I needed to make sure I got it absolutely right. Getting it wrong would have consequences that would not be good for me, or much more importantly, would not be good for the BBC. So the stakes are high. And so this is how it goes. We settle on a subject. That subject would normally be suggested by us, but would be okayed by our editor. We then will work on a draft script. Depending on the subject, it can take a day or it can take 5 days, but normally takes a day or two. Once we've got a draft script, we've always lined up at least one, but normally 2 and sometimes 3 or 4 BBC experts on a given subject. So I'm working on a video that I'm going to post after I've spoken with you about Russian false claims of the need for denazification in Ukraine. That's been through our bureau chief in Moscow. It's been through colleagues at BBC Ukrainian. It's been through senior editor in the newsroom. It's been through my editor, who's also a separate senior editor in the newsroom. And it's also been through a Russia expert at BBC Monitoring. So that's 5 people. Now, normally it wouldn't be 5. Normally it would be 1 or 2. We send the script to all of these experts. They come back to us. Sometimes they'll say this is fine. Sometimes they'll say the whole premise needs looking at. Fortunately, that's very rare. Quite often they'll come back and they'll say, okay, so you've used this quote, but actually you need to understand there's a bit of nuanced context around that quote, which you should emphasize a little further to make it clear the context in which that phrase was said. We then make however many changes are needed. Sometimes it's none, sometimes it's more. We would then redistribute the altered script back to the experts to say, are you happy with this now? They would normally then come back to us and say, okay. We would then distribute it to our overall editors and say, okay, this has been seen by the subject-specific experts. Now would you look at it generally? They either reply saying, okay, you're good to go, or they come back saying, actually, please, can you alter this? And it's only at that point that we then build the running order for the piece. We go onto set, we record it, it's edited together. It's then shown as a completed video to one of the senior editors who had seen the script. And only when they've seen the video does it then go out. So the level of oversight is considerable. The level of oversight on all BBC journalism is considerable. But because of the nature of these videos and the fact that at times we are calling stuff out or describing things in blunt terms, let me just state the obvious, they need to be right. And the last thing I would emphasize to all of you watching is it's a useful lesson that I've, that I feel more keenly. I felt it keenly when I arrived, but I feel it even more keenly now. If in doubt, just don't do it. The stakes are too high if you burn your reputation as an organization or as an individual journalist to get things wrong. And so even if we are just 1% unsure, we'll just pause and we'll go and check, and then we'll be sure, okay, we are happy with it. It's 100%, let's go. And I'll give you one example. We did a long video. It broke those rules you were talking about, Gavin, about the problems at Wembley for the Euros final last year. And we were pretty close to doing it, 95%. I could just see the producer was struggling to get some of the details totally signed off by everyone. And we were like pretty sure they were all correct. And we just paused it. We just took another 24 hours. It got out later than we'd wanted, but it didn't make any difference. And I think it's on 900,000 or 1 million views on Twitter. And so, yeah, if we have any doubts, we work it through. And in fact, on this video I'm about to post, we were ready to post it this morning. I watched it once more. I had a slight question about one tiny element of it. So we went back to a couple of editors, discussed it some more. We're happy with it, so it will now go out. So it's a long way of saying we're cautious.
But I think you're less on a kind of treadmill of deadlines with these videos, I would guess, than having a.
Well, I think that's true and not true. So on the video I'm working on at the moment, there isn't a hard deadline. The issue of false Russian claims about denazification have been there throughout the war, and so if it went out yesterday or today or tomorrow, it's not particularly important. The issue is one for the whole conflict, not one for today. But sometimes, for example, on the Prime Minister's comments about the leader of the opposition and Jimmy Savile, or some of the developments with Partygate, the heat has really been on. The developments have happened at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and if we don't put a video out that evening, by the time we get it out the following evening, it won't be worth doing. So sometimes more often than not, frankly, we're under severe time pressure, and it's when you're under severe time pressure that you need to stay cool and not rush the most important decisions. And quite often I will be here at 25 to 7, knowing that we're going on air at 7, knowing that I'm going to have to record this video or do this video live so we can clip it, and we're still having detailed discussions about one word in the script. So sometimes those judgments go down to the wire, and there's no avoiding that. But the point is, in that moment, you've got to stay cool and you've got to not rush. And if you're not sure, you don't do it.
Okay, I'll stop blathering on now and let you all have the opportunity to ask some questions. I'll go in the order that we've had them in the chat, so you'll know when I'm coming to you. We'll start off with Lucy Woodham. Lucy, are you there?
Hi Ross, nice to meet you.
Hi Lucy, nice to meet you.
So I'm on the broadcast path, and like Gav said, we've got a social video assessment coming up. So one of the things we can do is an explainer video. So I wanted to ask, what are the building blocks of a really good explainer video?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the first building block of an explainer video is, what are you explaining? You need to set the parameters of what you're trying to explain. And if you make those parameters too broad, you're going to come unstuck. So when people start watching an explainer, they need to have a really good handle on what they are going to have explained. And one of the things you need to watch out for is biting off more than you can chew. Because if you pick a very broad and not very specific subject, you'll kind of end up in a bit of a wishy-washy place. So it's always a good idea to say, okay, today, what am I explaining? The second thing is, you need the context. So you need to set up why you're talking about it. So I'm working on another explainer at the moment, which is considering whether what we are all experiencing as a country with COVID at the moment is really the kind of situation that we need to get used to in the long run, is what is right now actually the normal that we have to get used to. Now, to really unpack that, first of all, you've got to establish what's happening. So you've got to establish the number of cases, why we think the number of cases are driving. Are they connected to policy or the new version of Omicron? You need to establish the degree of disruption to schooling, to the NHS, to workplaces like the BBC. That's all the context, right? So you need to set up the reason why you're asking the question before you need to set up the explanation before you then launch into the explanation. So if you watch my videos, often the first bit is the setup. So if you see the video I'm about to post, which is about the false claims of denazification, it starts with me listing examples of Putin making false claims about denazification. It's me saying, okay, this is the thing I'm looking at. So setting that up is useful. The next thing I would say is, this is easier said than done. You need to decide what is essential and what is a luxury. So on any subject, there are thousands of pieces of useful and interesting information. You can't put them all in. Some of them are interesting, some of them are essential. So which are the bits of information that if you didn't include, you couldn't explain this issue? And which are the bits of information that actually you could live without them? They're just interesting to know. And you'll know what the advice is. You need to ditch one section and you need to keep the essentials. You need to know what the essentials are. The next thing is, I always have a list. I either keep it in my head or sometimes I'll write it down, or just go, what are the things people are confused about? What are the things people want to know? So the reason I'm doing an explainer on, is this how we're going to live from now on, It's because everyone's going, is this how we're going to live from now on, right? So but there are other questions within that, which is, to what degree is this connected to policy? To what degree would opening windows help? To what degree will the severity of COVID reduce? Or those are all questions that people have got in their minds. So when I'm making an explainer, I like to have a list in my mind of the questions that by the end people should definitely have concluded. The next thing is texture. So if it's just a lecture, if it's just a monologue, I'm sure you're a very good broadcaster, but certainly no one wants to listen to me for 5 minutes without breaks. So you need to think about texture. You need to think about what are the different elements I can use to explain this. And so Outside Source, when it had a touch screen, or now when we have this suite of graphics, has, one of the things I'm very fond of this format is we have a lovely variety of things that we have a variety of tools we can use to explain. So think about how much of a mixture of content that you can use. I could go on, but I'll give you a couple more. Next is think about how you take people from one part of the explanation to another. So a classic way of writing a GCSE history essay would be to go, I'm talking about Henry VIII. First of all, I'm going to talk about his wealth. Then I'm going to talk about his health. All right. And at the end of the wealth section, I'd go, and so that's the situation with his wealth. And then you would go, let's also consider Henry VIII's health. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, right? But if you're telling a story, you don't want to have blocks. And so when I point this out, anytime you watch one of my explainer videos, you'll see me doing it because it's a kind of trick I use again and again. You've got to use hooks to take people from the place you've got them to onto the next place you want them to go to. So I might say, and while some of Henry VIII's courtiers were worrying about his health, others were worrying about his wealth. And then I would go on. So this is a very basic example, but you need to think about what I call joining sentences that take you from one part of the explanation to the other. So you keep taking people through it rather than them feeling like there's a block. That for me makes an explainer much, much more watchable. And then my final bit of advice is, you've got to answer the question, right? If you're promising an explanation, so you need to think about how are you going to tie this together? It's not okay to just go, there are 3 or 4 elements to this and just stop. You need to think about what is the way you're going to join this back together and leave people with a thought that is going to help them understand the thing that you're explaining, which I know is the same for writing any article or essay, but it can still get lost. Now, quite often when I'm making explainers, we'll be quite far into the process and we'll look at the script and I'll say, everything we've got is factually correct. Everything we've got is written well. Everything we've got is well researched. There's no problem. But what are we trying to say? Like, what are we trying to say? So if you ask me, what am I trying to say about denazification? I would tell you, there are some neo-Nazis in Ukraine, but they're a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the Ukrainian military, and they do not in any way represent the false depiction of the situation from Russia. So that's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm going to take 8 minutes, but that's what I'm trying to say. So knowing what you want to say and making sure you say it at the end would be my final thing. My final tip is, when you've made it, watch it back. And if you feel that it's lagging at any point, you've got to fix it. You can't wish it away. If you're spotting it, your audience will feel it. And when you're producing a digital piece of content, they just move somewhere else, right? They just close the video, they just go somewhere else. So spotting those moments of weakness where the explanation is just not quite holding you, they'll always be there. I mean, they are whenever I do them anyway, but if you can spot them, you can fix them.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was quite a long answer. Yeah, as you can probably tell, this is all I've been thinking about for about 2 years.
Lucy, your assessment next week better be really good now.
It will be.
So next question is from Ben Summer.
Hi, I was just interested because you were talking about sort of longer video, shorter video a while ago. What your views are about TikTok for journalists? Obviously, sort of seems to be a platform where a lot of explainers are coming up now, and the BBC seems to be one of the organisations that hasn't delved into it as much. I'm just interested in maybe what conversations have been happening or what your views are.
So it has. It's just BBC has just started doing TikTok videos. I think it announced it 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. So no, you could be forgiven for having missed it. But I think we've started posting Ukraine-related TikTok videos. Look, I don't have any profound thoughts on it beyond if one of the biggest websites in the world is being consumed by vast amounts of people, often younger people who are parts of the population in your country and other countries you want to reach, if you're not thinking about how to be there, that would appear to be a missed trick. The danger is for big organizations like the BBC's, or even just graying journalists like me, is if you kind of barge in with like kind of, ta-da, we're here. And you need to be humble. My view on these things is you need to be humble in how you approach these and understand that you're entering an arena where you haven't been, and as such you need to look around and get a feel for what's working and what's not, and approach it in that fashion. But it's quite right. I mean, I'm glad the BBC is doing it, and I hope we do more. I posted some of my explainers, not many, 2 or 3 up on TikTok. It's a strange experience, because like one of them did 8,000 views and one of them did 1.3 million, and you can't really tell why. But the bigger lesson I would say, which is a broader thing, which is that being humble, because I think I first got a job editing a website when I was 24 or something. So I've been kind of dabbling around in digital journalism in one form or another for ages. And the one thing I've learned is that anyone who's telling you they know where it's going in 2 or 3 years, largely, I mean, they can't. And anyone who tells you they've cracked a format or a product before they've even tried it, I would suggest are being overconfident. You can go in and make educated guesses, of course, and you can make plans for products, and that gives them a good chance. But the big lesson I've learned is try things and observe what works and what doesn't work, and evolve what you're doing. So Gavin's quite right to notice that my explainers on the bushfires are not the same as the explainers now, because we've learned and hopefully improved them. But I think that, I mean, I would just say, I'm slightly repeating myself, but I remember once that the BBC News was experimenting with Snapchat, and this is a slightly random story, but I was in Mumbai for a marketing trip, and it happened to be the 2020 Cricket World Cup, and I had bought a ticket to the semi-final, and the guys back home heard and said, would you kind of do a Snapchat updates from the game? I mean, I just had no idea what I was doing. I had no feel for the format, what worked, what didn't work. I couldn't even tell what was working and what wasn't working. It was my fault. It wasn't my colleague's fault, but it was just an example of, it taught me to always respect the medium and understand the medium. So rather than making a digital product, these explainers, I don't just go, yeah, I'll just make an explainer. We have a different plan for the different types of explainers we make for different, like we make different explainers for Twitter versus Facebook versus YouTube versus the BBC News website versus, we're flexing in terms of how we manifest the product, because we respect each platform as a different thing with a different audience, and to give it the best chance, you need to really understand it. But that's just a long way of saying, yes, we should be doing it.
Are you recutting an original one there, or are you actually
no
a different lens?
No, we don't. It's not so much that we recut. We just make explainers for certain platforms. So for example, this one that we're doing on denazification, or the fact that it's not necessary, I think it's 9 minutes, and it's primarily aimed at BBC News YouTube page and the BBC News website. I will post it on Twitter, but it's the main target for that would be YouTube, because the longer videos do better there. So it's not so much that we're recutting, it's just that we're not making every video for each platform equally.
Okay. Next question, John Wimpress. John, are you there?
Hiya.
Hi, John.
Hi. I just want to ask, you were talking before about keeping your scripts like really sparse. I just wanted to know, are you still like editing them down, or is it just sort of natural now that your script writers are like
always coming down, and you always think, oh, I can't get any more out of it, and you can always get more out of it. So no, it's any script on my explainers would go through umpteen rewrites. So we would take last night, for example, when we recorded this most recent video, we'd already been on the script for, I'd looked at it multiple times, and then we finally put it into the Open Media, which is the production system we use, and I went through it again and was still taking words out of it. So you can't do it too many times, really. The more times you look at it, the tighter it will get. The thing I would watch out for, as well as being sparse, is just watch out for long sentences. Sometimes it'll just be a case of there's nothing wrong with these words at all, but it's one sentence that's 20 words, and it needs to be 2 sentences that's 10 words. The other good rule of thumb I use is you don't really want to be going I don't really want to be going more than 8 or 10 seconds without something happening. So if you watch my videos, I hope they have a sort of rhythm to them. You can kind of feel me working through the elements. And so sometimes I'll look at a script and there'll be nothing wrong with the sentences or the content, but there's just too much of it without me taking the audience somewhere. So we might keep the script, but we might lay some extra pictures over the second half of that section, or we might do something that helps take it on a bit. But what the thing that I've found over the years is you'll just work out ways of trading 5 words for 2 words. You'll think, oh, we've used that phrase again. We don't need that phrase because we could say it with 2 words. And you'll just get, the more you do it, it just becomes a habit. And you just spot the same turns of phrase that are causing problems. And I'll give you one tip on this. The single biggest thing which helps me write short scripts, I'm reasonably obsessed with taking names out of scripts. So a classic traditional BBC World Service script, which is where I spent many happy years, would say the Rwandan defense minister, and then would say their name. But if I'm making a story that's not for the Rwandan audience, particularly it's for a global audience, there's maybe not a need to say the Rwandan defense minister's name. Maybe I can just put it on an Aston, but I don't actually have to say it. Or we might say, I'm just making these up, of course, a bomb has gone off in eastern Baghdad. A classic news script would probably say that the neighborhood, might even say the street or the square. Quite often I would let the map on the screen do the work and just say a bomb has gone off in eastern Baghdad. And if people want the extra detail, it's in front of them. So taking names out is a very effective way of simplifying what you're saying. Not always, I hasten to add, but sometimes.
Thank you.
Next question's from Ellie. Are you there, Ellie?
It's actually me. So it's to do with obviously you talked about the Putin video and how you're going to start off listing the claims that he's making about Ukraine. How do you go about making sure that you're not just promoting misinformation, especially when someone might not watch the entire video? So they might just watch that beginning and then tune out.
Yeah, so it's a really important and interesting challenge, and one we've talked about a lot this week, and we talk about generally. When you're making digital products these days, you need to work on the basis that any part of your report could be taken in isolation. And so, for example, I'll give you an example of how BBC News has countered this, nothing to do with Vladimir Putin. So, for example, if we show a meme in a TV news report, and the meme is showing something that's not real, maybe it's a fake document or a faked picture, the BBC News now has a set of straps that we have to put across anything like that, because even though the reporter would be saying this is fake, if someone just screen grabs it without that audio accompaniment, suddenly it looks like BBC News is saying that this thing is real, or it could be construed in that way. So we have kind of broad policies on doing that. But in terms of your specific point, well, it was interesting. We were talking with Richard and Gavin before you guys came in. This is a big discussion that people have about reporting things that aren't correct. So when the Prime Minister made comments about Keir Starmer and Jimmy Savile, I did an explainer about how what had been said wasn't true, and got some messages back from critics of Boris Johnson saying that to report it was to amplify it, and that I shouldn't have done the explainer on it. To which I replied, well, if the Prime Minister has said something about the Leader of the Opposition in the House of Commons, I feel like that is worthy of reporting. But those are judgments that we're having to make. If you take another example, again, we were talking about this earlier, when Donald Trump first came out, I did the US election radio special, and it'd been a long night already, and then Donald Trump comes out and did that extraordinary press conference where he said, I don't accept the result. Now, of course you're going to broadcast that, and of course after it you're going to fact check the fact that he's saying it's been stolen and there's no evidence it has been. Now, in that moment you definitely report it, but Trump started saying the election had been stolen repeatedly every day for week after week after week, and it came to the point where you're starting to think, well, how many times do we have to play this in order to fact check it, given that he's already said this? And not just the BBC, but more broadly, the amount of airtime we gave to that false claim was reduced because we'd already effectively rebutted it multiple times in the previous weeks. So these are, I'm not dodging the question. I'm simply saying that you're dealing with, these are judgments. But in the case of this report on denazification, for example, the headline won't say Ros Atkins on Putin's, don't quote me on this because it may change slightly, but it won't say Ros Atkins on Putin's Nazi claims about Ukraine. It will say, because there's a risk that could be screen grabbed and it seems like I'm treating those as reasonable claims, it will say Ros Atkins on Putin's false claims about Nazis in. So you put the word false in right at the top. So you are setting out before they've even heard a word from Vladimir Putin that we are saying this is not true. And so there are techniques that you can do to mitigate against misunderstanding. I would say that you can mitigate it. You can't get to a point where you can be 100% sure that something you put into the digital domain will not be twisted or misrepresented, because there are 101 ways that people can do that. But you can certainly do things that that mitigate heavily against that. And in an example, and you'll see this when I post the video in a minute, so I play Vladimir Putin saying a couple of things about denazification, and then straight off the back of it, I say, what Russia is saying about this is untrue and distorted. So it's like there's no, you don't have to wait. You're not having to wait any period of time. Like I'm straight in with an explicit statement that this isn't true, and then we unpack the nuance underneath that as well. So there are techniques that you can use. But coming back to my advice of half an hour ago, that would be a great example of where I would do what I think is best in that situation, and then I would go and get lots of advice on it. So in those really pressured situations, you want as many eyes on that as possible.
Thank you.
I got that far without muting. One more question we've got time for before Ross has to pop off. So Gabriel Morris, Gabe, are you there?
Yeah, hi Ross.
Hi.
So I've noticed while I was watching your videos that you always wear the dark blue shirt. It's not something you would traditionally see in like broadcast news on the telly. And so I'm wondering, is that part of like the social media branding to wear the same thing, or maybe is it continuity?
It's a good question. I do wear blue shirts a lot. Got one on today. So the history of this is that when I launched Outside Source, I was trying to create a news program that felt just as informed as other news programs, but was more informal. And I asked if I could not wear a shirt and tie and wear something more casual, and the bosses thought that wasn't the right thing to do. So I carried on wearing a shirt and tie. And then in 2017, we relaunched the program, and I asked the question again, and they said, well, we use this stylist. Why don't you go and see this excellent stylist and see if she can come up with something that might work as an alternative? And she's called Jane Field. I still work with her. She's brilliant. And we experimented with a few things. And I didn't want to look like smart casual is as I'm sure you're all well aware, is a difficult zone for a middle-aged man to go in. You can look like you're going to a kind of slightly mediocre garden party if you're not careful. And so we played around with a few different options. And she said, I think you look very good in dark blue. Why don't we try you wearing a dark blue shirt with a dark blue jacket? Because if you wear a light shirt, you look, as I say, you can look a bit like you're at a garden party, or that you just forgot to put your tie on. And so we kind of experimented with a few different dark blue options and settled on a kind of dark blue shirt and dark blue jacket. And I started doing that and carried on doing it. And then that was kind of the plan. So I was just wearing variations of dark blue, and no one really paid too much attention to it, to be honest. And then these videos started going, and it became a bit of a thing. And it became almost part of the visual offer of the video. It's always on the same shot, this shot where I'm sitting in the same place I do the video. And I'm always wearing, it's not the same shirt. I hasten to add, I do have a number of shirts that are not all exactly the same, but they are all blue. And it's almost become part of the visual offer of the explainer. But that's not the only reason I don't change it. It's just that we never really found a different way of being smart casual on the TV that didn't look like I was going to a garden party or that I'd forgotten my tie. And so on one level, I think it works. But that's why. I didn't anticipate it becoming a thing, but it kind of has. And if I don't wear a blue shirt anytime